Hello everyone. Today in the 9th community call, we will be looking at the design first approach of APIs with API automocking feature. I'm Naduni Pamudika, a senior software engineer at WSO2, working with the API Manager product team. Here's the plan for today's session. We'll be starting the session by looking at available API creating with endpoint management, and then we will be looking at REST API with the API automocking feature, and finally we'll be ending up our discussion by seeing how to publish the tested prototype API. In the last community call, we discussed the GraphQL support in WSO2 API Manager. We started the session with an introduction to GraphQL with the basics and the key characteristics. And there was a brief comparison of GraphQL over REST. And we discussed the importance of an API gateway for a GraphQL service. And finally, we ended up our session by seeing how to deploy a GraphQL service as a managed API in WSO2 API Manager. So API creation options. With the last community call, as you remember, we created the GraphQL API using an SDL. So in today's session, let's see what are the other options available. So API creation is the process of linking an existing backend implementation to the API publisher. So that you can manage and monitor API's lifecycle, documentation, security. WSO2 API Manager provides you with 6 options to one by one. In WSO2 API Manager, you can start by providing a name for the API and the version, context, and do. Okay, sorry everyone. So the second option is to create, and as the third option, you can create a GraphQL API using an SDL, and there's the option to create a WebSocket API. And by creating a WebSocket API, it allows an API creator to expose a WebSocket backend as an API. So then finally, via the API Manager, you can expose a SOAP service as a REST API as a pass-through, or you have the option to generate a REST API using a SOAP backend. I hope now you have an idea what are the options available in WSO2 API Manager to create an API. As I mentioned earlier too, by creating an API, what are we trying to do is linking an existing backend API implementation to the API publisher to easily manage the API's lifecycle and so on. So here an existing backend is an endpoint. So when creating an API, it is mandatory to deal with the endpoints, and there are several types available. An endpoint is a specific destination for a message, such as an address, a whistle, a failover group, or a load balance group likewise. So WSO2 API Manager supports a range of different endpoint types. So let's see what are the supported types in WSO2 API Manager. You have the REST endpoint type, where a REST service endpoint, which is based on a URI template, and There's the HTTP SOAP endpoint, which is a direct URL of the HTTP SOAP web service. And by using the dynamic endpoint type, the requests can be dynamically routed to a different endpoint addresses based on a specific condition, like some request parameters, payloads, etc. So when using this dynamic endpoint type, you have to provide a mediation sequence there. So the other type is the prototype endpoint. There you have two options, prototype implementation, uh, which we are going to see later in this discussion, and the prototype endpoint type. And finally, there's the AWS Lambda endpoint type, where you can use to invoke AWS Lambda functions through WSO2 API Gateway. So now we know that there are several API types you can create in WSO2 API Manager, and there are several backend types available. And the other key factor in API management is the life cycle. So an API life cycle has predefined set of states. These states represent the stages that an API has in the process of starting to develop an API until its retirement. So the WSO2 API Manager related APIs have a life cycle that contains 6 stages, which allows you to identify in which state that the API is currently in. So for example, say when you create an API, it is in the created state, and after you do some relevant design and runtime configurations, you can move it to the published state. Let's see what are the available lifecycle states. They are the created state, where you have the API available in the publisher, and there's the prototype state where you can use it for early promotions and testings, and there's the published state where it is readily available for the consumers in the developer portal, and there are 3 other states like deprecated, retired, and blocked. So now you got to know the API creation options, different types of endpoints, and lifecycle management details. I went through those details first to make those terms more familiar for you. So now we are heading into the main part of today's session, that is the API auto-mocking feature. So let's look at how to design a REST API and deploy it as a prototype API to make it available for your time building a mock REST API from scratch. That's why we are involving this API auto-mocking feature into this. So API auto-mocking feature gives users the ability to prototype REST APIs with inline scripts. This feature is available only for the REST APIs, and this can be used for testing purposes as an early promotion, and this allows subscribers to try out and test APIs without subscriptions or monetizations, allowing them to provide feedback to improve the APIs. So the publishers can use this to make changes to the APIs requested by users. The WSO2 API Manager prototype payload on an API definition. Let's see how we can do that in the demonstration. And you can prototype an API using the inbuilt JavaScript engine without having to manually write the JavaScript implementation for each of the resources in the API. So let's create a prototype API with mock response payloads and deploy it as a prototype. prototype. So here I'm logging to the publisher as Jack. And as I explained, these are the options available in WSO2 API Manager, REST API from scratch, and create a SOAP, REST API from the SOAP backend, and a GraphQL API, and so on. So I have this Swagger pet store, and I'm going to use this Swagger definition URL to so I'm copying this URL, and since I have the Swagger file, Swagger URL, the OpenAPI definition, I'm going to use the second option. So I'm selecting the OpenAPI URL. If you have an OpenAPI file, you can use that. I'm pasting the OpenAPI definition URL here, and it validated. Clicking next. Now you can see it picks the name of the API and the context and the version. Since here we are trying to deploy this API as a prototype, we don't need to provide an endpoint here, also the business plans. So I'm clicking create, and it says that API created successfully. And when you go and see the available resources for the Swagger Pet Store API, now my requirement is to test these out. And as you can see, this are not available. So I'm going back to the endpoints. These two are for the API. So I'm going to use the prototype endpoint, the implementation type. Then as you can see, the resources will get available. And for each of the resources, you can see the automatically generated response like this. So for the pet ID, pet/pet ID resource, you can see likewise the response. So I'm going to or any of the ID response, and I'm going to return the dog's details like this. So yeah, likewise you can customize or manually edit the responses available here, and I'm going to save it. Okay, now we have successfully saved the Swagger Pet Store API's Swagger definition with the responses. And now, since we have provided the prototype implementation, we can deploy it as the prototype. You don't need this endpoint and business plans because you are going to deploy this API as a prototype. So I'm clicking on deploy as a prototype. And now my Swagger Pet Store API has deployed as a prototype, and now I'm going to the developer portal to consume it. So as you can see, for this prototype API, I don't need any subscriptions. And see, I haven't logged into for the developer portal. That means I don't need any authorization or authentication to consume this API. So I'm going to try out this pet/pet ID resource, and I'm going to provide the pet ID as 0. Clicking execute, and as you can see, we get the default response for cat. And if we say we are going for 7 also, we are getting the same because we didn't customize it. And we added the response for 1, and yeah, we are getting the response as dog for the pet ID 1. Likewise, you can deploy, create, deploy, and invoke the invoke a REST API like this as a prototype using the API auto-mocking feature. So as I mentioned in the demonstration, you do not have to subscribe to the API or pass an authorization key to invoke a prototyped API. Now let's see how to publish this prototyped API. When publishing the prototyped API, it needs to provide an actual backend endpoint or endpoints there. And after the API is published, the users need to subscribe and generate an access token to invoke the API. Okay, let's see how to publish that prototyped API we just created. So I'm back in the publisher. This is my Swagger Pet Store API, which is in the prototype state. So I'm demoting it back to the created state to do some changes and do the publish. So to publish the API, so I'm going to provide an endpoint. Now I have provided the prototype implementation type. Now I'm going to provide a REST endpoint for as my production endpoint. So under the HTTP REST endpoint type, I'm going to provide the production endpoint. Here I'm using a Mocky endpoint. In the actual environments, you need to use the actual backend URL or the REST endpoint of your backend service. So I'm going to click save and okay, so going back to the life cycle. Still the publish button is not available because we have to omit it there, and click page. You can see the publish button is available, and I have satisfied both the requirements to publish the API. So I'm clicking publish, and yeah, lifecycle state has been successfully changed to published. So I'm going to dev portal and let's see whether we can try it out without providing an access token and all. So I'm going to the same resource, trying it out by providing the pet ID as 1. When you click on execute, it says that invalid credentials, or it gives the error unauthorized. That means, as I mentioned, in order to invoke or consume a published API, you need to provide an access token. So to provide an access token, you need to subscribe to the API first. So I'm going to subscribe to my Swagger Pet Store using the default application. And I'm going to the applications, and I'm going to generate an access token for my applications. So I'm going to use the production keys and generate access token. Okay, so I'm copying my access token, and now in the Swagger Pet Store, I'm going to provide my access token here, the generated access token. Now let's see to invoke the pet ID resource by providing pet ID 1 and clicking execute. Okay, so now we are getting the response successfully. In that way, you can publish and successfully invoke the pet store API, which is readily. So that's it. Open for any discussion. Please raise any questions if there's any. Hi all, if you have any questions, it doesn't matter, it is not related to this topic. You can ask anything related to API management. Hello, yes.
I have, hello, it's my first time in this community call, and I have shared a message in the chat.
Oh.
It's a question, so I don't know how if I have to ask my question directly or I have to use the chat to post my question.
Yeah, you can go ahead and ask the question, please.
Okay, so my question is, if it is possible to deploy an API or a group of API directly to the API gateway without using the publisher web interface. So we deploy the API when we deploy the API manager directly.
You mean without deploying it via the UI?
Yeah, exact. So what I want is when I deploy the binary, the API manager binary, I include in the configuration file the API I want to publish.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Ruki.
You can do that actually.
Yeah, explain.
Yes, I hear you.
Hello. So actually, with API Manager, we have two gateways. Like we have standard Synapse gateway and micro gateway. So with standard gateway, actually you cannot do this just uploading into a file to the gateway. So you have to go through via the publisher UI. But the concept like with the micro gateway, you can deploy file direct to the micro gateway, and then you can deploy the file. But then later you can also publish it to the UI as well, or the standard API management interface. Then you can manage from the UI as well. So with the micro gateway, you can get that feature.
Okay, yes, understand. So okay, so
actually
the micro
like,
gateway. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Actually, this supports Swagger-based API approach, Swagger first approach. Using that, you can like you can design or you can implement your API using Swagger, and then you can deploy the API using WSO2 controller, and then you can deploy the gateway.
Okay, so if I understand, if I want to deploy a file containing my API, I have to use the micro gateway. This is the only solution we have actually. With the normal gateway, I have to use the interface.
Actually, what you have to use is you have to use some WSO2 API controller. Using that, you can deploy in the micro gateway.
Micro gateway.
Yeah. So finally, actually, ultimately your API will deploy in micro gateway.
Okay, so, and actually I'm using an Ubuntu instance. With micro gateway, I need a orchestration, or I can deploy it on Ubuntu.
Yeah, actually you can deploy in Ubuntu, but you can use other orchestration system like Kubernetes or Kubernetes Docker similar orchestration.
Okay, and what do you recommend?
Actually, the micro gateway is designed and optimized for orchestration. Sorry?
Yeah, actually, what do you recommend? What kind of do you recommend Ubuntu or Kubernetes to deploy the micro gateways?
No, actual thing is you can deploy in either environment, but our micro gateway is optimized for containerized systems. But it doesn't matter. You can choose whatever the system you like, you prefer. So that is based on your deployment and the current existing system.
Okay, yes, I think definitely I have to switch to microgateways architecture because I have a need to deploy this file during the setup. Okay. Thank you. That was clear.
And also other options like with the standard gateway. Yeah, so with the standard gateway also you can use the REST APIs, and using REST API also you can design your API using Saga, and you can push via the REST API to the gateway. So that approach is also there.
Yes, I know. So I have already experienced it, the REST API, but it doesn't fit my need. I think I have to use the micro gateways to cover my need.
Yeah. So in that case,
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. It's clear.
Okay.
Have any more questions? Will be held on 25th of the Google form for your topic suggestions for our next session. And you can join our ongoing conversations on WSO2 API Manager using Slack, Twitter, and email. And you